Hello, welcome to this year's Carpenter lecture. The world's strangeness has forced this format on us, but since we have to be on screen, we decided to turn the medium into the message. We're delighted to be here in Jane Austen's dining room for what will be a less formal discussion about Austen screen adaptations. I'm Samuel West, an actor and director. This is playwright and screenwriter Laura Wade, and we are ambassadors for the Jane Austen house. We're joined by Professor Kathryn Sutherland of Oxford University, who is a trustee of this place. More about Kathryn in a minute. Now then, who's your Darcy? Laurence Olivier? Colin Firth? Matthew McFadyen? David Rintoul? Perhaps your Darcy can never be reduced to one person. Our choice defines us. One of my favourites recently is Isabel MacArthur, who's currently playing him in the all-female Pride and Prejudice Sort of at the Criterion Theatre in London. The problem, it seems to me, with calling something a classic is that you no longer have to read it. You just put it on the shelf marked classics and wait for the BBC adaptation to come along. This approach can have its pitfalls. I know of one English Don who assured with some truth that A Muppet Christmas Carol was a faithful adaptation of Dickens, watched it and taught it instead of reading it. It wasn't until one of his students pointed out that there weren't in fact two Marley brothers, played by Waldorf and Statler, that he realised his mistake. That won't be our problem today. I'm quite open about my Austen shortcomings, but Laura is a very well-read Austen fan, as well as being my partner and the mother of our two young daughters. And we're both really here as cheerleaders to today's quarterback, Professor Kathryn Sutherland, Emeritus Professor of English at St Anne's College, Oxford, author of several books about Jane Austen, writer of the introduction to the Penguin Classics Mansfield Park, and co-editor of Jane Austen's Teenage Writings for Oxford. Laura and I first met Kathryn when, in a hugely enjoyable and informative visit, she came to talk to the cast of Laura's adaptation of The Watsons, which I directed. The West End transfer of that show has sadly been delayed by COVID, but we're delighted that Kathryn is here to talk all things Austen with us.
So we've chosen to focus on 5 adaptations in particular. They're all feature films. Sense and Sensibility, the 1995 version with a screenplay by Emma Thompson, directed by Ang Lee. Persuasion, also 1995, directed by Roger Michell from a screenplay by Nick Dear. Full disclosure, Sam's in that one, he plays Mr. Elliot. Oh, look, there you are. Okay. Clueless, which was inspired by Emma, written and directed by Amy Heckerling, which is also from 1995. Mansfield Park from 1999, written and directed by Patricia Rozema. And Bride and Prejudice from 2004, written and directed by Gurinder Chadha, which is a Bollywood retelling based in Amritsar in India. 3 of our 5 directors are female, and all but one of the screenplays are by women. That's not how we planned it, but at a time when only 11% of the top-grossing film directors are women, we're really pleased it turned out that way. We've chosen 3 films from 1995, and we've still managed to leave out the best-known adaptation of all, the Andrew Davies, Simon Langton TV Pride and Prejudice from the same year. But as I say, we've chosen to focus on films, haven't we, for continuity.
I'm sure that adaptation has led many people back to the book, but sometimes, as I said, it can be a substitute for reading it. As Kathryn told us, many's the A-level essay which mentions Mr. Darcy going for a swim in a wet linen shirt, a scene which Jane Austen inexplicably decided to leave out of her novel. Kathryn, we've called this discussion What Makes a Good Jane Austen Adaptation? It strikes me that we're coming at this question from 2 different directions. We're makers of theatre and entertainment, grandly called, and academics with a deep and wide knowledge and appreciation of all of Austen's works. So I think we should, from our side of the table, we have to include what makes a successful Austen adaptation, which would have to include good box office, critical success, and if you're lucky, a legacy of approval over the years, which I'm sure we'll discuss.
So, Kathryn, what was it, first of all, about 1995? Why was there that sudden explosion of Jane Austen films? Is that a good place to start?
It might be a good place to start, but an even better place to start is with Jane Austen herself. And I've got 2 books out here to show you. And these are school textbooks that Jane Austen used and that she then handed on to her niece.
Wow.
One is entitled Elegant Extracts in the Art of Speaking and Reading, Thinking, Composing.
And in the Conduct of Life.
The Conduct of Life, that's very important.
And there's a beehive to show that where you fit in
that's
British
right,
society.
into the whole society. The other one has an even less inspiring title, Mentoria, or the Young Ladies Instructor.
Goodness.
These were school textbooks used at the end of the 18th century for the instruction of girls. And these are two textbooks that were actually owned by Jane Austen herself, as we can see from the inscriptions. And she handed them on to her niece Anna.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Anna Austen, yes.
Who's also confusingly called Jane.
Yes, she's
Right.
called Jane Anna Elizabeth
Okay.
Austen. And this one, Anna hands on again to her own daughter, Anna Jemima Lefroy. So they're well read, as you can see, well used. They're really quite frail now, these textbooks. And Jane Austen is reading from these herself as a teenager. And you can tell from the titles, you know, they're not designed to inspire any teenage girl. Mentoria, I mean, what a yawn that is, if you even understand what it means. And she takes these books, and in the stories she's writing herself, at the same time as she's reading these books, she completely turns them on their heads. For a start, these are serious passages of improving literature, and her teenage stories are all about girls behaving badly. These girls refuse to be improved. They go to the other extreme. The other thing she learns, though, from these stories is how to abridge. These are books of extracts. They're abridged, they're shortened passages of improving literature because, of course, a girl having a gnat-sized brain can't take too much information in,
Obviously.
so as tiny as possible. So she learns the art of abridgment. And when she starts writing her teenage stories, yes, the girls are rebellious and scandalous, but she's also thinking about how do you adapt something large into something small. One of the stories in here is called Amelia Webster, and it's actually a spoof on a novel by Samuel Richardson,
Samuel
a novel,
Richardson.
yes,
That's right.
Charles Grandison.
Who wrote enormously long novels.
Exactly, so you have a novel in 7 volumes in letters. She reduces the 7 volumes of letters to 7 letters that fill 5 pages. But it still makes sense.
She's an adapter's dream.
So she is an adapter's dream, yes, it still makes sense. So she's thinking about what a story needs to work and how spare and thin it can be. So it needs strong character, it needs dramatic entrances and exits, and it needs a compelling action that carries you from one end to the other, which is usually only about 5 pages.
She's thinking like a screenwriter.
Yes, she's thinking
already
like a screenwriter.
at the age of
Yes.
teenager.
Yeah,
That's I mean, it's
wonderful.
almost the first thing you learn as a screenwriter, isn't it? How late can you come in and how early can you get out?
Absolutely, absolutely. And she's playing with genre as well.
Yes.
And that kind of playfulness. I mean, as an adapter, as a screenwriter, that feels like wonderful permission almost from Jane Austen herself to have quite a bold approach if possible.
Certainly when we were doing the Watsons, your experience of the juvenilia allowed us to be much more playful because we felt we were being truthful to her spirit.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I also like that, I mean, 100 years before Hilaire Belloc, she's bored by her cautionary tales and
Oh,
sort of
absolutely,
doing her own
yes.
version.
Absolutely,
as he
yes.
was in Sending Up Straw Pit.
Yes,
You know.
yes, completely
Yes.
madcap and irreverent stories. She's turning things on their heads, but it's such a critical art as well. She's thinking like a critic from the start.
Critical in
Critical in the sense of critical of the genres that she's working with. And she is constantly shifting genres, as you say. So she is moving a story into a play. Lots of these are little playlets that are based on longer narratives.
And did she write short plays when she was young?
She does write short plays, yeah. She has one called The Mystery. And you never actually find out what the mystery is. The characters are just whispering to each other and they're passing on a secret. But never do you find out what that secret is.
That's
It's
wonderful.
really, it's just hanging in suspense.
So she's refusing to be spoon-fed the mentoria and being very playful.
And
I mean, we'll come
she's
back.
taking what she finds and she actually smashes it up. I mean, she really does throw it up in the air and see where it lands.
Well, that's permission for all of us to try and do the same. And we'll come back to the juvenilia because it features in Patricia Rozema's film of
It does, yes. Yes.
Mansfield Park
Where
as well.
she actually talks about the difference between the male abridger and the female novelist.
So-
She actually uses that passage from Northanger Abbey, where Jane Austen says, why on earth are we so hung up on these books of abridgment written by men for girls, when actually what we have is this wonderful female form, which is the novel. And the Jane Austen slash Fanny Price character actually uses that in Rozema's Mansfield Park.
Very nice.
Brilliant.
What's the first visual input into our experience of Jane Austen?
Well, the first are in fact engraved plates in the 1830s, but very interesting and I think hugely influential on early adaptation, both stage and for small screen television, is the line drawings that you get in the 1890s illustrated editions. We have here Pride and Prejudice, it's illustrated by Hugh Thompson. It sold hugely and it was essential to the fan base of Jane Austen in the 1890s. In fact, it's in the introduction to this by George Saintsbury, who was an academic at the time, that the word Janeites is coined.
Do we get any sense of who they are, apart from them fangirls?
It's just everybody who loves Jane. Everybody, in other words.
Not exclusively female, but we
no,
imagine
not
largely.
exclusively female at all. In fact, most of Jane Austen's early admirers and editors, public admirers and editors, were men. Show
us a couple of the illustrations.
But what's interesting and innovative about the illustrations is that they are line drawings. So the book technology had just arrived at the point where you could, in fact, include images, these line drawings, within the text.
A young man such as you describe, Mr. Bingley, so easily falls in love with a pretty girl for a few weeks, and then when accident separates them, so easily forgets her. And these sorts of inconstancies are very frequent. There they are, talking about it on rather a hard-looking bench. Everybody with very good posture.
Very good posture, wonderful facial expressions
yes,
too.
Very.
But they are closed interior scenes, almost exclusively they are closed, they're domestic. They are pretty authentic in terms of the dress and the general sort of domestic
Certainly
furnishings.
if you were a hair and makeup artist, you would study those, wouldn't you? Definitely.
Yeah. And what you're getting quick changes between text and image.
And that previous one was actually in the middle of a sentence, wasn't it?
It was. So
we're used to the idea of a plate on something
exactly.
glossy and separate.
So that you can sort of consider it separately at your leisure. But these, you're reading and you're looking. So your brain and your eye are being pulled together or perhaps pulled apart at various points. But what happens, I think, through it is that as early as this, the 1890s, there is the sense that your understanding of the novel is being, as it were, filtered to you through visual images. So it isn't just imagining for yourself, but you're being encouraged to have an idea of what the characters looked like, how they grouped together.
It's sort of the first adaptation, isn't it? Because it's an intervention between the imagination of the reader and the writer. There's another person in the room all of a sudden, which there isn't before. There's a level of strong visual interpretation being offered to you.
I mean, famously in radio plays, you paint all the scenery yourself, which is why it's the best scenery that there is.
That's right.
But here, the choice of images is, as you say, mostly internal, and even when external, quite sentimental.
Yes.
Lots of Victorian children. You said that this artist also painted the Pears soap adverts.
Yes, he did. Hugh Thompson did the Pears Annual.
You can definitely see that.
And you can see that in these wonderful children.
And of course, the choice of what to illustrate very much, curates our experience of the book.
Yeah,
which is sort of what we're talking about
it does.
today. Oh yes, look at them.
These influenced stage productions. There are a huge number of stage productions of Austen's novels through the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and then they also influenced the TV classic serial, that sort of tea time and Sunday afternoon classic serial.
It's television shaped, isn't it?
It's television
the framing
shaped, exactly.
Of it,
but there is a sense, I think, as well of it as being designed for domestic consumption. You don't go to the big screen to see this.
Very much. The frame is pulled in. They've zoomed in, and It's a lot of things. It's domestic, it's funny, it's about behavioural, it's comedy of manners, but it isn't cinematic.
It's not cinematic. It's quite coy as well, I think, isn't it? It's quite coy. And it is the creation. I mean, in the 1890s, we're slap bang in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. And this is a Regency world that's just beyond reach. It's quite nostalgic too.
So in 1890s, we've already got early silent films of, well, we're a few years away from the first silent film of Shakespeare, for instance, which I think was King John for some reason. Again, sentimental. He's got a kid in it.
I didn't know.
And if you go 20 years further up, the Hays Code being on the edge of American censorship means that American distributors and filmmakers start making large numbers of Shakespeare films in the hope that the local authorities won't close down their dens of iniquity, because cinemas start getting a reputation as being a bit down market. So they make lots and lots of adaptations of, well, particularly Shakespeare, lots of silent Shakespeare.
In order to be educational?
Yes, in order to say, no, we are, don't shut us down, we can continue to make our films about sex and drugs. But they don't make films about Jane Austen.
No.
Why is that?
No. There is only one Jane Austen film that goes into production, and that's MGM's 1940 Pride and Prejudice with Laurence Olivier and Greer Garson.
That's right, yes.
And that's generally seen as a film that was used to bring America into the war effort. So it was a kind of, Jane Austen standing for the country, for England, for values that need to be defended.
Well, it worked.
That's right. I mean, Greer Garson then went on to do Mrs. Miniver, didn't she? Which had the same effect, and yes, it worked.
But famously, she's wearing Victorian crinoline.
Oh yes, I mean it's antebellum American Civil War dress, isn't it?
Totally the wrong period.
Yeah, totally the wrong period.
In that we now have a shorthand of high hair and empire line dresses, and they had
we know what it looks like now.
No.
But it's still extremely fussy and domestic and closed. I mean, the sets of that film are awfully confined.
And it didn't lead to a great explosion of Darcy, although it was very successful.
It was very successful.
And as I said in my introduction, many people's Darcy is still Laurence Olivier. So then we go from that 1940 film adaptation into a smaller frame, as you say, radio adaptations, television adaptations, which very often show their age. There's a famous early 1970s adaptation of Persuasion, which I looked at because I was in the 1995 adaptation. And all the ladies have got sort of Laura Ashley hair and purple eyeshadow. It's subtle, but sort of 1806 crossed with 1973. And as you were saying in the discussion before, it's always the hair that gives a period job away, isn't it?
It is the hair. It is the hair. Yes, I mean often the hair looks quite lacquered as well, doesn't it? It's it's not a natural look.
It's filtered through the time.
Yeah, it's filtered very much through the time.
So what happens if we think we've given ourselves a good hinterland to the 1995 explosion?
Yes.
What happens to get us there? Because these films, if they all came out at the same time, aren't inspiring each other. Because then they would come out 2 or 3 years apart.
Yes, they're not reactions to the other's success, are they?
There's a disturbance in the force.
Because you're getting Sense and Sensibility, Persuasion, and the Andrew Davies,
and Clueless,
all at the same time. All at the same time. I think to separate off the Persuasion and Sense and Sensibility from Clueless, they are heritage movies, and there is from the 1980s. There is a movement towards heritage film. I mean, first of all, it's Merchant Ivory.
Yes.
And then you get the...
You were in all of them, weren't you?
I was the lower middle class bit. Yeah, I was in. But actually, there is a Howard's End connection, so we should go back to that. Go on.
But generally, I think we can explain that by the 1980 Heritage Acts, and specifically 1983, which is an act for managing heritage buildings. And heritage buildings and what Britain has to offer as tourist destination.
Right.
A sort of image of England. Again, it's nostalgic, in the way that this is.
Yeah.
But we're 1983, we're in Thatcher's Britain.
We have been for a while, yeah.
Yeah. It's post-industrial, society is fragmenting.
And
This is
certainly
a
nostalgia
vision-
was not a vibe in the 1960s. Things were knocked down. I mean, witness the fact that we wiped a lot of our old television programs,
Yes.
including, I'm sure, some Austen adaptations.
Yes, we
because
did.
why would we keep them? We
Yes.
want to make new ones.
Yes. But suddenly culture has a different sort of message. If society is fragmenting, we can offer a vision of England which is integrated.
Right.
And also, it's going to be very good for revenue.
Yes.
So it's a vision of England to sell to ourselves and to sell to the rest of the world. So you have magnificent country estates rather than broken down council estates.
Yes. It's a sort of a fetish of the feudal, really, isn't it?
Yes.
Because, I mean, if we think about it, most of us would be in the kitchens or the stables, wouldn't we? At those big houses.
And
So
Jane
you wouldn't
Austen
be sitting in the living
famously
room.
isn't interested in those people. I mean, they populate her novels, but they don't speak. The
That's
servants.
right. That's right. And so lots of these heritage movies, as you mentioned, they focus on the middle classes, the upper middle classes, the gentry. It's a vision of England and a coherent society. I mean, the other side of that would be that Train Spotting is a film that comes out at exactly the same time as these heritage. So that's giving you the broken council estate rather than the posh country estate. But that's what it's about. So these are heritage movies.
I have a friend who went to see Train Spotting and says, I don't know how they can say it glorifies drugs. Did you see the state of their flat? But we should be specific about Jane Austen's middle classness,
Yes.
shouldn't we? Because post Downton, which of course we all now are, even me who's now doing All Creatures Great and Small, set in 1930s Yorkshire, which is pretty much depressed, and we have Christmas parties that are a little bit more expensive and chintzy perhaps than they would have been pre-Downton.
Yeah.
Am I right in thinking that Austen never aims higher than an earl or even a relation of an earl in her?
That's right.
In her characters.
Yes. I mean, one of the things she says to Anna, in fact, the girl to whom she hands on, the niece to whom she hands on this book, Anna herself becomes a novelist. And she says to Anna when she's reading a draft of one of Anna's novels, now, keep it real, basically, she says. Just talk about the people you know and the people you might have met. And
Two or three families, yes.
And Jane Austen's world is the gentry. And she herself she had family who had rather better connections than she had, but she was on a sort of scale of gentry that was kind of falling. So she's lower gentry.
And even in Persuasion, the Viscount is in awe of. Forgive me. Even in Persuasion, the Baronet is in awe of the Viscount Lady Dalrymple,
Yes.
and they have to present them in the hope that she will. But Austen isn't interested in her. We never really see her. She doesn't know
that's
her.
right. I mean, from Austen's letters, which are a wonderful, I think, source of information for us, it's quite clear that she did make those visits to people who might be able to further her brother's career. And, they are a bit toe-curling sometimes, and you realise that she's gone along to schmooze somebody because he's an admiral and her brother is still just a post-captain, and, maybe the admiral can get her brother a ship of his own, and you think, yes, she did do that.
Well, we were looking at Emma Thompson's diaries from
Yes.
Sense and Sensibility. One of the appendixes to which is all the houses they've shut in.
It's all these splendid sort of historic houses that have been used, and she says here, doesn't she, and you might like to read it, that she just describes a house there, and then this paragraph is wonderful, I think.
The ball visited by the Dashwood sisters was staged at Wilton House near Salisbury, Wiltshire, a 16th century mansion largely designed by Inigo Jones. The room is filled with paintings dominated by a massive portrait by Van Dyck of the Herbert family, who still owns the property. Furniture and mirrors by Chippendale and William Kent. Many sovereigns, including the present Queen, have been entertained in this magnificent room, and in wartime, the Normandy invasion was planned in the double cube, which is a huge room.
I mean, it's just bizarre over-information, isn't
Wonderful.
it? But cram as much heritage in as you
But we
can.
should say that room inflation, like grade inflation, is something that has happened, I mean, even pre-Downton, but certainly post-Downton. Everybody is in rooms that are too big and too grand for the time, aren't they?
Yes.
In the films.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, look at
Absolutely.
when we were researching the Watsons, we came here, and it was a very important day for us because we noticed how little space anybody had.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when we were designing a play, we chose to confine the central room much smaller and less comfortable than we could have done.
Yeah.
And also not very many, as we saw in those illustrations, comfortable things to sit down on.
Yeah.
So this sort of, I mean, you said the word sumptuous.
Well, yeah, I mean, you hear an adaptation being described as sumptuous and think, well, oughtn't it not to be sumptuous?
Oughtn't it not to be sumptuous?
Sumptuous, you know, is that the point? I mean, I suppose with making a film, there is the practical element, isn't there? That, you know, making films in a tiny space is very difficult if it's a real location and you can't take a wall out to do your
Yes, if
reverse
we were filming
shot.
this, if we were filming the scene in a film, we would want to get rid of that wall
But,
for the wide shot, and we can't do that.
I think something that Sense and Sensibility does really well, and which I think any adaptation needs to do, is give us a very clear visual language in order to understand the status of those people. So when we move from Norland to Barton Cottage, we do get a proper comparison sense of the smallness of those rooms, and that tells us a story visually.
They're small and meagerly furnished, aren't they? And when Marianne is playing the piano,
everybody's
they're
2 feet away,
crowded around her, but
Yes.
you sense that there's almost nothing else you could do in that room other than that.
And that sense as well, that wonderful scene where Emma Thompson's sitting having a cup of tea on the stairs and there are people weeping in 3 different rooms, and you can hear who's behind which door, who's weeping in which room, because it's so small. You really get the sense of that family having gone from a place where you could get away from each other to constantly being in each other's pockets.
And in fact, the cinematographer tells the story there by pulling above Emma Thompson and her cup of tea, because that's the only way you can get the sense of space and isolation and loneliness in what's a small space. If you choose to shoot in a real house, which Ang Lee and Emma Thompson do, then you can. He makes a virtue of the necessity. Ang Lee does a beautiful thing with the cinematographer whose name I can't remember. I'm sorry, but beautiful job. He shoots from outside rooms quite a lot, through doorways, and there's one extraordinary scene after Marianne has been rejected by Willoughby, where the camera pulls away from the scene and a window and the frame right is being blown. A curtain in the window is being blown by the wind. And it's quite a decisive, well, it's a decision to pull away, but the camera work justifies it, because he's taken this slightly backward step all the way through of seeing people through doorways. I think it's absolutely beautiful.
It's sort of isolating them.
Yeah.
It's a useful way, I think, as well of including Jane Austen's slightly ironic detachment. Sometimes.
We should talk about this, because this is really this is the elephant in the room, isn't it?
Jane Austen.
Jane Austen.
Can't call Jane Austen
Sorry,
an
Jane.
elephant. Her desk is over there.
The elephant's desk.
Try not to look at it. But yes, I mean, I think something that any Austen adaptation on film needs to do, and something that I think these 5 that we've been looking at all find their own way of doing, is how to get Jane Austen into the room. And one of the things that we all love and feel when we read those books is the voice of the author and her very specific voice, and the free and direct speech style that she does, where she is kind of speaking as if through the character, but you understand that she's ironising them at the same time. And that's so important to the character of those books and the character of her as creator. And it's not something that you can very easily transpose to film when you're moving from that written style into the visual. So
that's right. How you can be inside and outside at the same time. The visual is not subtle enough, really. You just see.
No, it's not. And very easily I can imagine how a bad adaptation would just become a series of events. And that's not what we love about a Jane Austen. I mean, obviously her plotting is intricate and exquisite, but that's not why we love them.
That's why Clueless works so well, isn't it? Because Clueless is not a direct transposition of Emma.
Yes.
Not at all.
Not at
Yes.
all. But it gets I think it gets the spirit of that novel.
Yeah.
Well, partly
remarkably well.
partly because because Cher has given a voiceover.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this is famously the first line of Emma. Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever and rich, with a comfortable home and happy disposition, seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence, and had lived nearly 21 years in the world with very little to distress or vex her. So it seems a perfectly straightforward introduction, but of course the word seems, which here becomes seemed, seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence. It's a little Jane Austen bomb in the first sentence going, oh no, she's absolutely fine. And of course that word invites us to look under the surface of Emma Woodhouse, who is, the first word about her is handsome. And then, she would say, I've lived 21 years, I know lots of things, and this is from a woman in her late 30s writing this. And of course that becomes Alicia Silverstone using an app to match up her clothes to go to school in a Southern California high school, saying, yeah, I have a normal life.
Yes. Against the backdrop of her ridiculously privileged existence.
Which I think Amy Heckerling absolutely gets the spirit of that.
Yes.
Yeah.
In one sentence, really.
Yeah, she does, because there's the action of the Cher character living the life, and then there's her voice.
Yes.
And you realise that there is such a mismatch between the two, don't you?
Yes,
Such
that
an absolute
juxtaposition
mismatch.
works really well, and I think she continues that throughout the film, doesn't she? And we understand that.
And also, as Paula Byrne points out, Jane Austen uses the word in this lovely book about Jane Austen on the theatre, on the stage, and also in the film.
Really wonderful book.
She uses the word project. Cher in Clueless uses the word project about people she's working on, which is exactly the same word that Emma uses. So whether that's accidental or deliberate, it's a brilliant choice.
I thought it was very interesting, Amy Heckerling, in an interview, the director of the film, in an interview said, Emma would be a Hollywood director. She said she is somebody who lives in a fantasy world and basically wants to manipulate other people for the best possible reasons.
For the best possible reasons, for art and friendship and for their own good. I mean, I think we should, it's a perfectly good film, but we should mention the Gwyneth Paltrow Emma, which I think is less successful as an adaptation, even than Clueless, of this book. Partly because Gwyneth Paltrow is not handsome, she's incredibly beautiful. And, you put her face on screen and you think nothing but lovely thoughts about her, whereas Emma's growth to a sort of moral goodness is an important part of the story. You had the same problem with your film of Posh, the Riot Club. You put three boys with great cheekbones in close-up and everybody thinks they're marvellous. And also slightly because I think the director sort of fell in love with her as well, whereas I don't know whether it's because Amy Heckerling keeps that distance.
She keeps a distance from the narrative as well. You realise that it isn't about just reproducing the story, it's reproducing the spirit. And I think sometimes, in your great phrase, reproducing the spirit gets you closer to the voice.
Yeah.
Okay, so we
Can I add something on that though? Sorry. But I think there's something in the fact that because it's a bolder take, because it's not such a close adaptation, I think we forgive it more.
Yeah.
When Clueless cleaves close to Emma, it produces a sensation of delight in us who know the book.
Yes.
But when it doesn't, we're not cross at it. We're not going, where's her sister? Or, who's the equivalent of all these other characters that Amy Heckerling doesn't choose to include. Yeah. So, on some level, it's doing a slightly less difficult job than something that is a straighter adaptation.
Dorinda Childhood turning the five Bennett sisters into four.
Yeah.
Is actually rather a good idea because two of them are a bit like Cleone and Kitty and a bit the same. So she's done that and nobody goes, where's the fifth sister?
Yes.
Well, you couldn't do that if you were Andrew Davies.
Bride and Prejudice and Clueless as well have both got another genre in the mix that they're playing with the conventions of Bollywood film or the conventions of the Hollywood high school teen movie. Yes. So they've got another toy box.
I think that's right.
As well that they're playing with absolutely delightfully.
So I'm interested in this idea of the authorial voice, which we know is so important and which we love in Jane Austen's novels, and which the lack of, I think, is a problem in Bride and Prejudice, not for the film's own sake. I mean, it cost 7 million and took 24. It's a very successful film and it's deeply enjoyable, and the musical numbers are terrific.
Yeah.
I don't think it's very interested in Jane Austen's authorial voice.
I don't think it is. And you feel that the stories are kind of clothesline to hang the songs on, and they're great.
They're great.
And you do have that sense of exuberance and joy as you watch
Darcy
it.
and Elizabeth are going to quarrel and they'll get out, but there's no sort of deep sense of character or anything more than a tiff.
There's no tension there, I think, really, between the characters. I also think that it's a problem that the subplots are not there. I mean, you know,
Yes,
for
it's a
all that
shame,
it is a joyous teenage movie, Clueless, it does have those dark undertones. When Elton drops her off in the car and, you know, she is attacked at gunpoint, you do have that sense of there is danger in this world. And there is danger always in Jane Austen's world, lurking somewhere. There's lots of danger in Pride and Prejudice, but there's no danger in Bride and Prejudice, I felt.
No, that is a shame.
And, you know, there are subplots which would, I would think, translate perfectly into this world of you know, Sikh Indian subcontinent.
Because actually
the
what
subplot of the arranged marriage.
Yes, I mean, that's a very clever way of putting something we find difficult now. The idea that if a man feels he's made a mistake in proposing marriage to somebody, he can't get out of an engagement, which of course he couldn't in 1806. And that's why so many women are so keen for men to propose, because once it's happened, it's their decision whether it goes on. But arranged marriage in a Sikh family in Amritsar is a very good modern correlative. So that tension absolutely works. So I want to move us on to the other films we're discussing and discuss where do you think, for a greater or lesser extent, that authorial voice is located. Let's talk about Patricia Rozema's Mansfield Park, a book which you know extremely well.
I know the book well. I actually find the film hugely ambitious and really doing something very interesting with the whole idea of reading, because she is thinking about a novel that's written in 1814, but that we're reading at the end of the 20th century. Absolutely. How do you read that novel at the end of the 20th century? And her answer is to put Jane Austen inside the novel. So what she's got in that film is she's got the academic criticism, the whole post-colonial discourse around slavery. She's got the novel itself, and she's got Jane Austen, who becomes fused, doesn't she, with the character of Fanny Price. And it seems to me that's a very clever way, fusing Jane Austen as a teenager and a teenage writer with Fanny Price as a teenager. Obviously, it distorts the character of Fanny Price, as we know from the novel, but it makes Jane Austen, in Patricia Rozema's eyes, own the film.
Yeah, because am I right in thinking that Fanny Price has long been considered a quite problematic heroine, and maybe that's why people haven't really touched, or hadn't really touched this book before in terms of adaptation.
She's the least sparkling and bright of Jane Austen's heroines. I mean, there's something quite pathological about her. In her, you know, she is always a little bit sickly. She's always retiring. She's always sort of pulling herself back from experience.
And she's not the most attractive woman in the book. That's also the problem.
No, that's right. I mean, she's paired, isn't she, with Mary Crawford, who's almost an Elizabeth Bennet figure, isn't she, in her brightness?
Yes. So which of them would you want to go to the pub with? It's
exactly.
not difficult to answer,
but I think what Rozema does so brilliantly is to fuse Fanny Price with aspects of Jane Austen's own life, aspects that we know from her biography, from her letters, and she splices those in. And that's her way of saying, you know, Jane Austen is owning this film. And whatever I say about slavery and so on, you know, it's Jane Austen will own it.
She doesn't call it a Jane Austen adaptation. She calls it a Patricia Rozema film, which I think is, I mean, she says, this is my take on it, and my job as an artist is to give you something new. And it's an extremely difficult book to adapt. But I think, I mean, you mentioned the slavery thing. This is a film from 1999, so already 22 years old, or 23 years old now. You would certainly not leave out the slavery. You would not make the slavery something that was referred to and not seen on stage. or on screen
Yeah.
if you adapted it now. It would be almost impossible.
Yeah.
This feels quite early, actually, for that
post-colonial,
engagement
yes,
with the
absolutely.
It's not
post-colonial.
early in academic criticism. I think that's
Right.
what's interesting,
Oh,
is she's
interesting.
taking academic criticism into the novels.
Right.
So it's
She's read
almost
her
as
criticism,
though
hasn't she?
she's
Yeah.
not taking the novel, as it appeared in 1814, but she's almost taking the Penguin paperback with all the annotations in the back, isn't she? And decided, I'm going to stuff those in as well. So Edward Said's commentary on the novel from his book Orientalism and so on is all stuffed in there,
So is that part of that whole kind of general school of criticism that minds that Jane Austen doesn't mention the wars going on, for example, that kind of historical context that she leaves out?
That's right, and just forcing that in. It is interesting that, we talk about 1990s as a breakthrough moment in Austen film. It was also a breakthrough time in Jane Austen academic criticism too. You get queer Austen, you get feminist Austen, you get post-colonial Austen suddenly, bursting out of their moral corsets. So, it's doing the same thing that
And the margins have
adaptations
gone to the centre now, haven't they? I mean, you
that's right.
you couldn't do an adaptation of Austen without including those subjects, really.
That's exactly it. No, it's a lovely way of putting it. The margins are at the centre. Yeah.
We've been talking about room inflation. I want to talk about the house that Rozema chooses, which is absolutely Elizabethan.
Yeah, it's extraordinary.
It's not at all a sort of flat-fronted Georgian Palladian thing.
No.
And I think that's a brilliant choice because, first of all, she gets away from the heritage crowd, and secondly, you see something that's been in a family for generations, so you implicitly ask how and where does the money come from, which of course is an important part of the plot. But I think that the sidestepping of that is really clever and a brave decision, because actually by then you're well into the 1990s heritage crowd, and you choose to say, "Nah, I'm not going there.
Yeah.
My film's going to look different." And then you cast Harold Pinter as the patriarch, who is brilliant.
Yes, he is, isn't he?
Terrifying.
Yes, he is.
And just a wonderful piece of casting.
I think as well she finds such a distinctive visual style for that film.
Yes.
Like you wouldn't see a shot from Mansfield Park and think it was a shot from any of the others.
No, absolutely sure.
The shots kind of look up, don't they, on Mansfield Park? So it has got that. It's almost like Count Dracula's castle. Those sort of shots.
Yes,
that you
the
get
sort of early Gothic.
Yes.
Yes.
And they're all kind of
early Gothic.
what's the word? The house is kind of pressing in on them.
Yes, it is.
Even and
weight
there's
of
the
history.
ruined parts of it, and it's sort of on rather
ruined
shaky
parts. This is meant to be a
foundations.
modern, new-built house in the novel.
But you feel it as a kind of the weight of an inheritance, really, almost.
That's
That
right.
you're seeing it through the eyes of someone like Tom Bertram, who looks at it as a millstone round his neck rather
But
than.
it is
something
a good
wonderful.
visual equivalent of what Jane Austen is saying in the novel, because she is saying this house as a family is on shaky ground now.
Yes.
And there you have it instead in
Yes.
the architecture.
So these feel like big, I mean, Rozema also wrote her screenplay, so these are big directorial interventions from somebody who has the sort of control as a writer-director that can often disappear between a screenplay and getting it to the screen.
Yeah.
And we have the same in Amy Heckerling, who also wrote the screenplay of Clueless. And we sort of have the same with Emma Thompson, who didn't direct Sense and Sensibility, but I promised you a Howard's End tie-in. Watching the credits of Sense and Sensibility in that brilliant sequence, which I'm sure we'll talk about, you see that Patrick Doyle has written the music, and Luciana Arrighi is the art director, and John Bright and Jenny Bevan are the costume designers, and they're all from Howard's End, which she'd made 3 years before. And the first 5 years of the 1990s for Emma Thompson are quite extraordinary. She wins 2 Oscars, one for acting and one for Best Adapted Screenplay. Still the only person to do that, and makes a number of other films. And when Ang Lee arrives, a Taiwanese director, out of his period, out of his register, out of his country, he very wisely says, when Emma suggests John Bright and Jenny Bevan, yes, I think they should definitely do the costumes. And Luciano, who won an Oscar for Howard's End, gives you just enough of that thing, even though it's 100 years earlier, for you to go, oh, I'm okay. I'm not exactly in Merchant Ivory Land, but I'm in a big, cinematic, correct enjoyably textured world. And that's very much set the tone for Austen adaptations since, hasn't
Yes,
it? I mean,
it
possibly
has.
not quite truthfully to the sense of the books.
Well, certainly higher production values, and you do feel that Jane Austen is being, brought into a world she might comfortably have enjoyed, but she never managed to make
No,
it
exactly.
there,
She should be
did
watching from the sidelines.
Yes, that's right.
And perhaps
That's
one
right.
film that doesn't quite do that to the same extent is Persuasion, Roger
Yes.
Michel's film of
I
Nick
actually,
Dear's screenplay.
I love that film, not just because you're in it, but
It's not a good enough reason.
I don't love it because you're in
I have to say, I love the fact that I am in it, because I remember seeing it for the first time and coming out and thinking,
but it's
I'm really
beautiful.
proud of being a part of this ensemble.
It's poetic, I think. It's got the beauty of poetry because its visuals are economic. Yes, they're rich and they're luxurious, and we fall in love with, because this whole heritage movie thing is turning texts into artworks. That's what it's about at one level. And it does that beautifully, but it also, I think, finds often a very economic visual language for describing something that's very complex and internal in the novel, but can't actually be achieved by any similar means in film.
Talk about that first appearance of Anne. We were
Oh, well,
discussing it.
yes, we were talking about this earlier, weren't we? About Anne, our heroine, when she first comes in. She sort of comes into the back of a scene
Yes.
and sort of sneaks through the door to listen to a conversation that some other people are having and sits very quietly on a chair, and she's holding a set of keys, which shows, from which we understand that she has a sort of a housekeeperly
Yeah.
job
She's not
among
even
the
in
family.
focus.
She's,
Yeah.
yes,
So it's a
absolutely.
medium wide shot.
And she doesn't say anything, and she spends
Yeah.
so much of the film as a sort of still point,
That's right.
with other people talking and swirling around her.
There's a wonderful
And-
sequence where she has to sit and listen to everybody complain about
Oh,
everyone
yes,
else, where
with
she
the
says nothing
Musgroves.
at all.
Yes, yes, and it's
yes,
cut
that's
together.
right.
And
She's in the
at tea.
Musgroves' house, isn't
Yes.
she? And they're all at her.
Yes, and there's a different person
And
in
she
each
just
shot. And,
occasionally
there's-
sips.
and
Yeah.
it tells the editing and the structuring of
Yeah.
that scene are so beautiful, and it tells us so much about her.
I should say that Roger Michel, God rest his soul, had two enormous advantages, and one prejudice, which may have been an advantage, which was that he'd worked with a lot of these actors in the Royal Shakespeare Company in the 1980s and 90s. I mean, when they said they want you to read for Mr. Elliot, I said rather crossly, "Who's playing Wentworth?" And they said, "Kieran Hines." And I went, "Oh, right, okay. Tuesday at 10, yes, I'll be there." Amanda Root and Kieran Hines, Kieran Hines is now a major movie star, but at the time they were Royal Shakespeare Company leading actors. And Roger, because he didn't have an enormous budget, which partly affects the look of the film, was able to say, "No, I want those people." And they said, "But Amanda Root isn't a star." And he said, "Well, partly that's the point.
Yes.
And secondly, just watch her."
Yeah. Yeah.
So she starts
Yeah.
without almost any makeup,
Yeah.
in the background, out of focus.
Yeah.
And she blossoms, and around her are these extraordinary actors, this incredible ensemble of Phoebe Nichols and Sophie Thompson and Victoria Hamilton, who's also in Mansfield Park, and Simon Russell Beale in one of his very rare television film appearances, just making it all sound so natural and so easy and so well spoken. And Roger has an absolute horror of wigs and makeup. So the result is that, unlike the 1973 Persuasion, the 1995 one still looks modern because there's almost no hair and makeup in it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Sue Fleetwood, who was sadly dying and had some chemotherapy and lost some of her hair, wears that extraordinary turban because Roger said no to the wig. So Alexandra Byrne, who does the costumes, that makes this amazing intervention, which it does its look. And I should say that one thing that allows that film to look itself rather than just like everyone else is that at the time everyone was cast in plenty of time, 3 months before in my case. And Alexandra Byrne, who didn't have a lot of money and had, funnily enough, designed the first thing I ever did in the Birmingham Rep Studio and has since won an Oscar for Elizabeth the Golden Age, said, "Look, I haven't got much money, but I've got time. So I'm going to make you a suit I'm going to make you a tailcoat and some breeches, but I haven't got very much money to spend on material. So she made the green tailcoat out of billiard table baize and the breeches out of mattress ticking, which was 6p a metre, I remember, because she knew my measurements 3 months before.
Yeah.
Nowadays, I would have been cast 2 weeks before, possibly 5 days before, and she would have had to go to a costume house and hire something. So all designers now are shuffling the same pack, which is why everything tends to look slightly the same.
That's interesting.
I wanted to ask you actually on that. Were you aware when you were, during the making of it, were you noticing things that made you think this is going to be really special?
I just think the quality of the discourse around it, really. I mean, Roger was a director who I worked with 4 times, 3 films and a play. And he was always able to make you think that this... Well, at his funeral recently, people said, after you'd made a film with Roger, you didn't want to make a film any other way. It just seemed like the way to do it. You know, there was rehearsal and everybody was wonderful. And it all sort of looked quite dirty and real. And everybody spoke it like they were making it up and not like they were talking 200-year-old language. And that's all you need, really, isn't it?
There's quite a lot of candlelight as well.
Oh, yes.
There's a lot of candlelight.
Actual candlelight. He uses these extraordinary things called triple-wicked candles. Right. I remember in the card scene, which is entirely... Those are triple-wicked candles. That's what they look like.
Are those a special film thing? Or
They have 3 wicks put together, so the flames are really big. And after you've done a scene entirely lit by candles, of which there were a couple, I remember using a Q-tip around the inside of my nostril, and it came out completely black. But I mean, there's nothing like candlelight.
A great detail.
But of course, there wouldn't have been anything other than candlelight. I mean, that's you said this is what we have to do.
Yes.
And nowadays, in fact, it's even easier. I mean, the fact that they did it on film in '95, because nowadays digital cameras could pick that up very easily. You wouldn't even need triple wick candles. You could do it with ordinary ones. But at the time, you have to say, no, this is how we're going to do it, and it's going to be dark.
It really creates the visual identity of that film, I think.
And how do you think the authorial voice works?
I think the authorial voice comes through actually in the imagery, and that's what I found so moving. I mean, that's one reason I got this out as it's this passage where the house is being put to sleep, Kellynch Hall. There is a short interregnum between Sir Walter Elliot leaving the house and Admiral Croft taking it over, and it's this little passage there, which is just a stage direction, but it turns into visuals, and it tells you how the house is put to bed, and so it's covered. You could read it.
Anne walks through Kellynch Hall day. Anne walks through various of the day rooms. In each, servants are engaged on throwing white dust sheets over the furniture. The linen billows around Anne. It's a sad picture, as if the deceased house is being wrapped in a shroud. On and on it goes, an ocean of white linen. More servants are busy on ladders, taking the family portraits off the walls.
Yes, that's brilliant, isn't it?
Taking a family portrait off a wall is a brilliant piece of
portraits coming off the wall,
tell, isn't it?
I mean, this is just a direction that doesn't actually. The words don't. They're not part of the text.
And she says almost nothing in the first half of the film.
But she's dressed in white in that scene. The furniture is being shrouded in white, and Nick Dear uses in his screenplay that as a stage direction, and it's also billows like sails. So
there's the naval element as well.
Between her mourning in the shrouds and her mourning and the naval element.
Yes.
I just think it's so clever, but it comes across. It comes across in the visual poetry of that film. It is quite a beautiful film, I think.
You mentioned Nick's version of the ending.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Because Jane Austen wrote 2 endings to the novel. There's the ending that we have that she published, and there's an ending that she never published. She decided to change it. And the ending she never published, she was unsatisfied with. We don't really know why, but it is very powerful. It's simply an ending that brings together Anne and Captain Wentworth, the hero and the heroine. And they're together, they're alone, and they have a conversation. It's around... Captain Wentworth thinks at that point that Anne wants to marry William Elliot, And he has come from the Admiral, who at that time is leasing the Elliot property, Kellynch Hall, with the offer that if Anne is going to marry Mr. Elliot, then he will break his lease and he will give the house back to them. And Captain Wentworth has this awkward task of turning to Anne and saying, I understand you're about to be married, and if that's the case, would you like the lease broken, or would you like... And she says, no, I'm not being married. And he turns to her and says, you're not being married? Oh, well, in that case. And suddenly it all pours out that they love each other. That was cut from the novel. It wasn't used, and a different ending at the White Hart Hotel with lots of people in the frame is putting in place. I guess because she felt she had to have a curtain call for every character. But that first ending is beautiful, and it's spare. You know, going back to Jane Austen, the great adapter, it's spare, it's economical, and it's the powerful voices of two people who discovering they love each other. Now, Nick Dear clearly reads that as well as the ending that was published, and he brings some of it in that ante-room to the octagon room in the Bath Assembly rooms. Yeah. He brings some of it in, but in the version in the film, they're interrupted. The Anne and Captain Wentworth are interrupted mid-conversation by Lady Russell, I think, isn't it?
Lady Russell.
So it holds it.
Yes,
and then
it holds it. And then releases it in the bigger...
Would it be heresy to say that Nick Dear improves on Austen at this point?
Oh, now careful. Think about where we are. These hallowed rooms. These hallowed rooms. I mean, what do you think of that?
Well, I think where you just said that you clearly were listening to what I was saying as a screenwriter, and you're thinking,
yeah, I mean, endings are tricky, and you've got to get to that point when the final kiss happens. We go,
But you're right, sort of bringing it forward, then pulling it back, and then doing it. So you get two goes at the ending, which of course she did have, but one we didn't know about. Yeah. But he allows the two.
Yes.
And that's great, isn't it?
It works. It works beautifully. I think. I wanted to ask if you think, if Jane Austen were with us now, would she be writing screenplays or dramas?
Well, in a sense she was, wasn't she?
Yeah.
I think
That's
so.
where we started from.
I think so. And, you know, what we forget, because they've been around such a long time, that the novel was new in her day. It also was pretty much the equivalent of film in her day.
Yes. Yes.
And in fact, many critics were very sceptical about the novel, and especially about giving the novel to young people.
Yes, you weren't meant to do that. It addles your brain, like too many video games.
That's right.
Yeah.
that they were, that they were sort of numbing. Also, the novel was controlled by just a few houses. It's a bit like the big Hollywood
Studios.
companies. There was the Minerva Press novel, and there were a couple of other big houses, and they had the effect of actually producing a lot of formulaic novels.
Right.
Novels could be written to a formula, a bit like lots of films. So, she was taking the formulaic novel and she was raising it up to something bigger. So she was a bit like an art movie producer, director, whatever, writer, in a world of a great deal of formula.
But the reason we're here and not in a multiplex foyer is because, as I said, adaptations do often drive you back to the novel, and it's not a disappointing process.
No,
it's a deepening, widening complexity. We are living at the moment, Rozema perhaps accepted, in a world where when we think of Jane Austen adaptations, we think of bonnets, we think of Empire Line, we think of romance, and only occasionally do we think of deep character. Propriety, moral improvement, understanding, wit. I mean, we do, of course, find all of those things in adaptations, but they are the soul of the book.
Yes, they are.
And I wonder if she was here, if she'd be writing for something like Succession, which gives her an absolute gift for dialogue, but over a long form allows her to be really the genius she was about character.
Yeah.
And that intricate plotting that she's so wonderful at as well, sort of the long form. I mean, when you're adapting a novel into the short form of a film, you have to lose so much plot. particularly when things are so intricately plotted, like Jane Austen. So I think she might enjoy that form.
I've really enjoyed going back to the screenplays, in particular Nick's and Emma Thompson's, which of course, as I said, won an Oscar.
Yeah.
I mean, just looking at the first 2 chapters of Sense and Sensibility and the choices that Thompson makes, actually even between the published screenplay and the film, where the book begins with the will of the father being read, and the film begins with the father, Tom Wilkinson, thank you very much for one scene, that's a bit harsh, isn't it? On his deathbed saying, "No, do this," and James Fleet, thank you very much, going, "Yes, I promise I will." And then over the next scene, which she puts into a carriage. Go on, keep going.
Yeah, so then we've got Mr. and Mrs. Dashwood in that carriage deciding how much money they will actually give to the family, to the women. And
in the book, they're already
reducing
there.
and reducing.
Yes, and she reduces him down over the course of the scene, and it's completely brilliant, completely economical.
And mostly taken from chapter 2.
Literally the dialogue, yes, although Emma Thompson is chooses which parts, so she edits it down, but also she puts them in a carriage, she gives it forward propulsion. The plot is moving, which with a film you have to constantly be moving forward. You have to be, they munch plot really quickly.
And through a number of things designed by Luciano Righi, going, don't worry, it's going to have enough look for you, but actually it's plotty as well.
Yes.
I mean, if this is sort of adaptation 101 in show and tell, I think we should all go back and look at those screenplays, because they are so fascinatingly good at doing what we've discussed. It's difficult to do well today.
Yes, I mean, I was thinking, we were having a talk about show not tell earlier, weren't we? I was thinking the ultimate version for me actually of that is Darcy jumping into the lake, which people have sort of thought about as sort of heretical, but it does something brilliant in telling us so much about him that we don't know that there's a wildness inside him, and that he's dealing with a kind of turmoil for which you need to take a cold shower, and but also that the place Pemberley, which seems to the rest of us to be a grand mansion, is a place where he can jump in the lake and take a bath and is at home, and all of these things are happening in what's been reduced in our collective imagination into a sort of
wet
t-shirt competition is actually a brilliant move on the mark, and a bold move on the mark of that adapter, because it tells us so much about him, about somebody whose job throughout 4 episodes before that, whose job has been to be mostly unknowable.
I think as well, if you're going to put Jane Austen into film, you have got to think about what you do with the heroes, because in the novels they are essentially moral instructors, moral instructors that girls fall in love with and marry. But that's a little bit of a problem in visual terms. How do you make that? How do you make that more interesting?
I have to say that there is one visual shorthand that any young girl would be wise to keep their eye on, which is that in Persuasion, in Sense and Sensibility, Greg Wise, and in Patricia Rozema's Mansfield Park, Alessandro Nivola, all the cads have very pointed sideburns.
That's code, is it, for a band?
Mid-90s code.
Mid-90s sideburns. So if you see sideburns sharp enough to prick yourself on, head in the other direction.
Probably in Cosmo at the time, how to spot a cad. Look at his sideburns, gauge how pointy they are, and stay well clear.
I think we could stop there. We've started with Colin Firth diving and we finished with Colin Firth diving. And Kathryn, thank you so much. That was really excellent conversation.
Great fun.
Good. Thank you for listening. And come here. It's great.